And what's the case we're going to be hearing tonight?
It's a case out of Missouri called the Housing Authority of the City of Independence, Missouri versus Lloyd Rickett. And let me tell you about the parties to this legal action. On one side, there's the Housing Authority of the City of Independence. It's a local government agency. Its purpose to provide low-income housing, and it was created by the City of Independence, Missouri, by ordinance on September 5, 1961. And on the other side is Mr. Lloyd Ricketts. He is a law-abiding disabled man. He became disabled because he was a victim of a vicious crime. He was viciously struck with a baseball bat when he was mugged. It made him disabled, and because of the disability, he had to live on Social Security payments and reside in public housing.
Mm.
Now, on June 4, 2004, Mr. Ricketts signed a housing contract, basically a lease, with the Housing Authority of the City of Independence. And in one section of that 25-page lease, and I doubt very many people read every section of the lease, there was a firearms prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
I read every section of the lease, but that's because I'm a lawyer. Most normal people don't, okay? This section stated that a tenant was, quote, not to display or use or possess or allow members of tenant's household or guests to display, use, or possess any firearms, operable or inoperable, or offensive weapons anywhere in the unit or elsewhere on the property of HAI, unquote. And now keep in mind, as I mentioned, it's a 25-page lease, and this is a little paragraph somewhere in there.
Right.
Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, Mr. Ricketts is a law-abiding citizen, not prohibited from possessing firearms, and he legally owned a Walther .22 caliber target pistol and a .50 caliber muzzleloader. And he used the .50 caliber muzzleloader to go deer hunting, when he was still able, before he became disabled, and the Walther .22 caliber pistol for target shooting. Also, Mr. Ricketts was divorced, and his estranged ex-wife at one point called the Housing Authority and made the false claim that Mr. Ricketts was suicidal. And then the estranged wife also contacted the Housing Authority and denounced Mr. Ricketts to the Housing Authority as a firearms owner. God forbid somebody would exercise their constitutional rights. Now, Mr. Ricketts was not suicidal or mentally ill, and the Housing Authority didn't even investigate those claims. But the Housing Authority did go after him with a vengeance in regards to the firearms allegation. Now, he's a firearms owner. They did an investigation into the issue of whether he possessed firearms, and the Housing Authority did this despite the fact that Mr. Ricketts was not a prohibited person, not prohibited from possessing firearms, despite the fact that Mr. Ricketts was guaranteed the right to keep and bear arms under the Missouri and the U.S. Constitutions, and despite the fact that the Missouri State Preemption Statute prohibited the Housing Authority from having a firearm ban, okay?
Yeah.
Not allowed to do it. I mean, they're committing an unlawful act by doing that.
Yeah.
On August 4th, 2004, after receiving the complaint from Mr. Ricketts' estranged former wife that Mr. Ricketts was a firearms owner, the Housing Authority contacted the city police and conducted a search of Mr. Ricketts' home and found two firearms: the lawfully owned .22 caliber Walther pistol and the .50 caliber muzzleloader. And again, Cam, got to remember, these guns were perfectly lawful. They were purchased and possessed in a lawful manner. Mr. Ricketts had every right to own them, protected under the Second Amendment and under the Missouri Constitution. And remember, the Housing Authority had no right to ban them under the Missouri State Preemption Statute.
Mm-hmm.
And the Housing Authority then served Mr. Ricketts with an eviction notice and gave him a three-day notice to vacate the apartment. 3 days and you're out. And the Housing Authority took the position that Mr. Ricketts had breached the lease by possessing the firearms in this unit, in violation of that section of the lease. But keep in mind, the Housing Authority never had the right to put that in the lease. And the Housing Authority, in their letter, also informed Mr. Ricketts that the Housing Authority had a, quote, one strike and you're out policy, unquote, in regard to firearms violations, and that, quote, due to this charge, you will not be afforded the right to a hearing, unquote. So, I mean, you've got a man exercising his constitutional rights, and unlike other criminal defendants who commit criminal acts, who get a right to a hearing, he for exercising a constitutional right is not even given a hearing.
Jeez.
And then on August 27, 2004, the Housing Authority filed a complaint against Mr. Ricketts in the Circuit Court of Jackson County, alleging breach of contract. They filed a lawsuit. And, as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Ricketts was on disability, was living in public housing. He's not a man of money.
Right.
He simply did not have the cash to litigate lawsuits. It's a lot. It's very expensive. Of course, the Housing Authority has publicly funded lawyers. State employees. City employees. Now, luckily for Mr. Ricketts, there's the NRA Civil Rights Defense Fund, and Mr. Ricketts' attorney promptly contacted the NRA Civil Rights Defense Fund, applied for funding, and the NRA Civil Rights Defense Fund granted the funding to Mr. Ricketts so that he could, in fact, defend himself and not become a homeless person because he can't afford to fight this frivolous lawsuit. Also fortunate for Mr. Ricketts, the Missouri Constitution protects his right to keep and bear arms. Article 1, Section 23 of the Bill of Rights section of the Missouri Constitution protects the right to keep and bear arms, and it's entitled "The Right to Keep and Bear Arms," and it reads as follows, quote, that the right of every citizen to keep and bear arms in defense of his home, person or property, or when lawfully summoned in aid of the civil power shall not be questioned, but this shall not justify the wearing of concealed weapons, unquote. Well, one thing that's clear here, Cam, we're talking about individual citizens having the right to keep and bear arms, use that word, and that you have the right to keep and bear arms in regards to a number of things, but specifically in regards to defending your home, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And also, fortunately for Mr. Ricketts, the NRA was successful in having a state preemption passed in Missouri, and that can be found in Missouri Annotated Statute Section 21.750. And what that does is preempts local government, like the City of Independence, and subdivisions of the state, or subdivisions from the local government, like the Housing Authority, from passing anti-gun measures and from regulating the possession of firearms. And Section 21.75 of the Missouri Code reads in part as follows. Here's subsection 1. The General Assembly hereby occupies and preempts the entire field of legislation touching in any way firearms, components, ammunition, and supplies to the complete exclusion of any order, ordinance, or regulation by any political subdivision of the state. Any existing or future orders, ordinances, or regulations in this field are hereby and shall be null and void, unquote. And then subsection 2 says, quote, no county, city, town, village, municipality, or other political subdivision of the state shall adopt any order, ordinance, or regulation concerning in any way the sale, purchase, delay, transfer, ownership, use, keeping, possession, bearing, transportation, licensing, permit registration, taxation, or other than sales and compensating use taxes, or other controls on firearms, components, ammunition, and supplies, unquote. I mean, pretty clear they're saying the state only at the state level can regulate how you purchase, possess, transport a firearm, and no city, including the City of Independence or subdivision, has the right to in any way, that's their word, quote, in any way, unquote, may regulate the possession and of firearms.
All right.
And so the Missouri State Constitution and the Missouri State Law prohibit the Housing Authority of the City of Independence from banning the mere possession of arms. But despite that fact, the Housing Authority sought to evict Mr. Ricketts and filed a lawsuit against him. Jeez. Not only did they do that, okay, but they then asked the city police to raid his home, and when they contacted the police to raid his home, they falsely told the police that Mr. Ricketts had been adjudicated as mentally ill. And by the way, if you're adjudicated mentally ill, you're not allowed to possess a firearm.
Yeah.
Well, that's not true. That's not true at all. And they told the cops this, the police department this, in order to lead the police into believing that Mr. Ricketts was disqualified for possessing a firearm. And again, Cam, not true, but based on that false assertion, the police confiscated Mr. Ricketts' firearms.
Oh, my gosh.
Now, they just will stop at no end. Now, Mr. Ricketts' attorney repeatedly warned the Housing Authority that their conduct was against state law and that the Housing Authority was violating both the Missouri Constitution, the right to keep and bear arms provision, and also the Missouri Preemption Statute. But the Housing Authority just refused to relent. Even after the attorney's warnings, the Housing Authority still insisted that Mr. Ricketts violate the lease and tried to evict Mr. Ricketts and continued with their lawsuit against Mr. Ricketts. And then on September 27, 2004, Mr. Ricketts' attorney filed a motion to dismiss in the lawsuit against this bogus lawsuit. The motion to dismiss was based on the fact that the Missouri Constitution protected Mr. Ricketts' right to keep and bear arms, and that Missouri law does not prohibit a law-abiding person from possessing a legally owned firearm in his or her home, and that under the Missouri preemption statute, local government cannot regulate, or subdivisions of the local government cannot regulate or restrict the possession of firearms. And because of that, the Housing Authority's lease provision prohibiting firearms was not only unconstitutional, but also specifically violated the preemption law, and therefore, pursuant to the preemption law, was utterly null and void. And then on October 26, 2004, the Circuit Court of Jackson County, Missouri, heard oral arguments. In other words, went all the way through trial.
Yeah.
And Mr. Ricketts' motion to dismiss, it didn't go to trial, it went to motion to dismiss. And on November 4, 2004, the court ruled in favor of Mr. Ricketts and granted Mr. Ricketts' motion to dismiss. And the result of that was Mr. Ricketts was not evicted. He wasn't forced to become homeless, just because he exercised his constitutional rights. And also his guns were returned to him on November 18, 2004. Now, unfortunately, Mr. Ricketts died shortly, after his vindication in court. But, because of Mr. Ricketts' sacrifice, we have this case in Missouri, which is a victory for all gun owners in Missouri, and particularly those who live in government-sponsored housing. And the case affirms that landlords of public housing cannot prevent law-abiding tenants from possessing firearms in their units. And the case also affirms the constitutional protections afforded by the Missouri Constitution's Bill of Rights, in particular the Missouri right to keep and bear arms provision. And lastly, it affirms, the preemption statute, which prohibits local government from infringing the right to keep and bear arms. Mm-hmm. Bottom line, we have a happy ending, but unfortunately, Mr. Ricketts, did not live much longer after his vindication. But the case stands for a principle that even local government has to abide by the law and doesn't have a right to violate the law and pick on law-abiding citizens.